Good morning. My name is Sharon. I'm the CEO of Climate Action North, and today's session is all about demystifying biodiversity net gain. So I'm hoping we are going to find out a lot today. I know we will because we've got two brilliant speakers. We've got Nick and Rachel. So Nick from Natural England and Rachel from Nattergal. So we're going to find out quite a lot about biodiversity net gain. But the reason why we wanted to run this event was because here at Climate Action North, we have um, quite a lot of roles that we play in terms of the community interest company that we run. And we run that with myself and Jennifer, Sheila, and Phil, and our associates, Nigel, Julie, and a few more the people that we work with. But one of the main things that we're working on is rewilding. And we also have a Northeast Rewilding Network, which is the easiest way to find out about that is to go onto our website and look for the network on the website and then connect with us that way, and we'll be able to send you an invite to join. So predominantly the network is for anyone interested in rewilding, whether you be a landowner, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a community gardener, an individual involved in projects with rewilding, or you just want to rewild your window box. We really don't want to leave anyone behind. So the Northeast Network is there for people to use. So please go onto the website and find it. Also, we are the local group leads for the Rewilding Britain network. And I know we've got Sarah King on the call today, who's the rewilding manager for Rewilding Britain. So Sarah has just shared our links, which is great, our rewilding network, and also her own as well, because if there are any large landowners here today, it's certainly worth exploring the Rewilding Britain network, which is there for larger landowners. And it's a really good way of finding out many things, not just about biodiversity net gain, but also about funding, about the environmental land management schemes, anything that's going on with regard to rewilding. It's definitely worth being part of the networks. So without further ado, let's just start with our first guest. Now, Nick White and I have known each other for a long time. We talked about biodiversity net gain a lot of years ago in IEMA, which was the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and sitting around tables with a lot of ecologists and environmentalists together to say how could biodiversity net gain work, what kind of things would we be needing to look at. And it was very in the very early days, Nick, wasn't it? And I think that must have been
Was
about what, how many years ago might that have been now? It's a long
eight,
time.
8 or 9. I'm not
I
sure,
think
but
so.
yeah,
Yeah, I think 8 or 9 at least. So, but yeah. So what I can say as well before we start with Nick's talk is if there are any questions that you need us to ask on your behalf, would you please pop them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of each person's talk. So Nick will start with his talk and we'll have a short Q&A afterwards, and then Rachel from Nattergal will come in with her talk, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. And then whatever's left over at the end, we'll have a collective Q&A if we can. So yes, so Nick, yeah, we'll talk about BNG. If you would like to share your presentation, we would love to hear your talk.
brilliant. Thanks, Sharon, and delighted to be here. Thanks ever so much for having me along as well. Let me just tee the slides up. There we go. And yeah, just before I start, when you were talking about rewilding as well, I'm also one of those people who's attempting to rewild my window box in the area around the bins as well. So look forward to hearing more about that as well. But morning, everyone. So as Sharon said, my name is Nick White. I'm a principal advisor in Natural England. So we're governance advisors on the natural environment, if you've not come across us before. And I've been involved with NatGain for about 8 or 9 years now as well. And this presentation is really going to try and just kind of set the scene in terms of what is biodiversity net gain, what's it trying to do, and then what are the kind of requirements of it as well. So firstly, before going on to the specifics of net gain itself, we're in a world of many crises, and I think it's quite unusual to see a policy come along where it can actually make a positive contribution towards a number of those as well. So we have a nature emergency, and as the name suggests on the tin, biodiversity net gain is looking to try and deliver benefits for nature as well. So it's looking at creating habitats, enhancing existing habitats in order to address the fact that sadly we live in one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and definitely in Europe. And the species we have really need those habitats in order to help them thrive and survive. But we also obviously have a climate emergency as well. And nature can play a role both in terms of helping to sequester carbon, but also importantly, a lot of change is already sadly locked in. But nature can really help us kind of adapt and become more resilient in the face of a changing climate as well. So those same habitats that can deliver the things that species need in order to survive can also help us as people, as societies and communities become more resilient and adapt to this changing environment by helping to manage flood risk, helping to cool our towns and cities, etc. We also know there's a huge now amount of empirical research demonstrating the real link between engagement with nature and our own human health and well-being. I used to work in the health service many, many years ago, and it was long established that actually, kind of wards that looked out over green spaces had better recovery rates. In Japan, the practice of forest bathing has been quite well established. There's actually now demonstrable empirical evidence to say that as you go through an area of woodlands, there are chemicals being released that are having really positive health benefits on our bodies as well. But sadly, not everyone has access to nature close to where they live and work. COVID demonstrated that. There are communities, particularly often in kind of more deprived parts of towns, where access to blue and green space is quite limited. Not everyone has access to a garden. And we're also in a housing crisis. People trying to buy or rent properties know the costs associated with that. And all too often, the way that those developments are brought forward, they don't necessarily provide us with the environments that people would like to live in. But there's a need for housing as well. There's a need to try and help the process of creating housing. So biodiversity, again, I think is quite unusual as a policy in that it can potentially speak to all four of these crises. So the focus on nature, but these other co-benefits as well. So what is it? Well, at its simplest, this is about a change of approach to development or land management. In this case, we're going to focus on development that leaves nature or habitats in a measurably better state than they were there beforehand. So the images on the right-hand side, that's my attempt to kind of illustrate the world using the medieval Lego. So typically in the past, you would have development plans come forward. Any nature that was there on site would get cleared away. Something would be built, in this instance, a block of flat, but the nature is gone. It's been lost. It's through that process. And typically those schemes weren't doing anything wrong in terms of the law. They were meeting the kind of requirements in terms of their species licensing, etc. But development was incrementally leading to this loss of nature. And what biodiversity net gain is seeking to do is attempt a paradigm shift to say that's not good enough. That's not good enough in terms of what nature needs to address the nature crisis. It's not good enough in terms of what we need as society as well. So it's saying that there needs to be measurably more nature at the end of the development process or courtesy of the development process than was there in the first place. It uses habitats as a proxy for nature. So it's not kind of looking at attempting to measure everything, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail, but it's using that as a proxy. But importantly, it's also not changing any of the existing kind of legal requirements or protections that nature has. So it is a real change. It's a radical change. And England is actually the first country in the world that's attempting this as well. So we're kind of world leaders in this regard. So Sharon mentioned the fact that discussions about biodiversity net gain have been taking place for many years, and there were some examples of kind of voluntary kind of projects coming forward, and good work by institutions looking at how this could work. But the real game changer was the Environment Act, which received royal assent in 2021. It's a very big, sprawling piece of environmental legislation, but within it is a new mandatory requirement that covers covers England and is for a mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain. This is what I'm going to focus on. So it does apply to England only. The Act covers wider jurisdictions, but the environment is a devolved matter, so biodiversity net gain only covers England. And what it does, it has the effect of amending two existing pieces of legislation. So it amends the Town and Country Planning Act, which is where most planning applications go through in the planning system. And it also amends or will amend the 2008 Planning Act. And that's a piece of legislation that deals with nationally significant infrastructure projects. So big new energy schemes, road schemes, etc. And it introduces this mandatory biodiversity net gain requirement on a staggered basis. So it's now come into force for Town and Country Planning Act projects as of this year. It's yet to come into force for NSIPs. That's expected in 2025. So the legislation applies down to mean low water, so it includes the coast, so coastal developments, and it requires that all projects that require planning permission, unless they're exempted, and I'll touch on those in a minute, have to legally demonstrate how they can achieve a 10% biodiversity net gain as calculated using a standardized biodiversity metric and through the submission of a net gain plan as well. And legally, a project cannot commence development until it can satisfy this requirement. It requires that project secures the habitats for at least 30 years in pretty much all circumstances. And that's, again, massive game changer. People haven't been used to thinking long term about how to manage and measure, how to manage and maintain nature. So it requires that the habitats are maintained for 30 years. There's different routes to delivering net gain, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And there's also now a national net gain register that anything that's being delivered outside of the development's own red line boundary has to go onto this national register, and I'll talk further about that. But the important thing is this is now a legal requirement that developments under the Town and Country Planning Act have started to have to deliver from this year. So it began for major projects in February of this year and was extended to minor developments in April. There are, however, some exemptions. So it does encompass the vast bulk of planning, but there are projects that aren't covered by this legislation. Firstly, householder applications. So if you and I are looking to put in a loft extension, for example, we don't have to deliver a mandatory net gain. There's also some exemptions for some custom and self-build projects. So if they're delivering less than 9 units, they're exempt. If there's a project it is having a very limited impact on nature as well. So if it's having a de minimis impact on existing habitats, those two are exempt, and that's to try and avoid people who need planning permission to put up signage, for example, having to meet this requirement. Permitted developments are also exempt. They don't go through the normal planning route. And also some environmental projects themselves often require planning permission. So sometimes if you're digging a pond, you require planning permission to do so. If you're providing biodiversity units for net gain, those projects are also then become exempt from this net gain requirement. But pretty much everything else is in scope. And that's a vast variety and range of development types. And include small developments. And there's a recognition, though, that smaller developers won't necessarily find delivering gains as straightforward, potentially, as some of the bigger projects. So there are some things that are designed to hopefully try and make life slightly easier for smaller developers. So the metric that I'll talk about in a bit, there is a more simplified version of it that can be applied to certain smaller projects. And when you are submitting a game plan to the planning authority, one of the things within that you have to include is a habitat management and monitoring plan. And there is a template that Natural England has published for that. You don't have to use that, but it's freely available if you choose to. And we've also produced a simplified version for smaller projects as well. So there are some things to try and make it more straightforward for smaller developments. Alongside the legislation itself, there was also planning practice guidance, which was draft. It's now been kind of formalised, and this was issued at the beginning of this year. One of the things it talks about the concept of a biodiversity gain hierarchy. And what that basically means is that projects who are subject to biodiversity net gain have to go through looking to see if they can achieve their gains on site firstly before they look to go outside of their red line boundary. It also reinforces the fact that gains have to be secured for 30 years. If the habitats involved are significant, and it defines what that means, and that's most habitats. There will be certain habitats that aren't regarded as significant, and they are things such as private gardens or planters. It's not possible to require a householder to manage their garden in a particular way for 30 years. So you can still use private gardens as a contribution to net gain, but there's not an expectation that they will be managed for 30 years. But if it's a public space, public gardens, for example, then the expectation is, yes, they would have to be managed for 30 years. As I said, it requires that you've submitted a management plan. It also sets out the relationship between this new statutory legal requirement so that people can't get out of this requirement if they're not exempted, and what a local plan may or may not say already about net gain as well. And it kind of details the relationship between the local plan and this national legislation, and the sort of information that projects would be expected to have to provide to a planning authority as part of being able to demonstrate they can meet this net gain requirement. And one thing to highlight is that biodiversity net gain and how it goes through planning is slightly odd in that it is a post-planning permission requirement. So it's not something you need to have demonstrated when you seek planning permission. But once you've got your planning permission, the law says your project still cannot start until the planning authority is satisfied that you are able to then demonstrate and meet how you're going to achieve this biodiversity net gain requirement. So you can't start any work on the ground, even though you've got your planning permission. So it's a material consideration at planning, but it's not something that you have to have satisfied in order to get your planning permission in the first place. So there's different ways that biodiversity net gain can be delivered. The expectation is that for most projects, they'll be able to do this on site. And this is particularly true, for example, of very large urban housing schemes. So the image on the kind of housing development that's somewhere close to me in Southeast London, it's a big residential development, and through better quality green infrastructure and landscaping, they've fully achieved net gain within the kind of red line of that development. There will always, though, be circumstances where delivering and meeting the net gain requirements fully within your red line boundary isn't possible. That could be for practical reasons, your site's quite small or constrained. There could also be sound ecological reasons why that's not possible. If you're trying to deliver certain types of habitat outcomes and the species associated with those are very susceptible to disturbance, or whether habitat will always struggle to reach a particular good condition because of dog fouling, for example, then actually delivering those outcomes off-site is a better option. And there's many different ways that off-site could be achieved. It could be a developer using their own land bank. It could be working with local landowners, farmers, environmental organisations, even local governments own land. And this includes rewilding kind of projects as well. And using that as a mechanism to deliver gains off-site. And on and off-site can be done in a combination. And then finally, because this is a legal requirement, so legally a project always has to meet and deliver biodiversity net gain in order to start. If there is a circumstance where you cannot practically deliver gains on your development site and you cannot find somewhere or someone with the right land to deliver the habitats you need, as a last resort, you can go to government and purchase what are called statutory biodiversity credits. Strongly advise people to avoid these if possible. They are expensive and deliberately so. So the intention is to have a contract with the local landowner instead, but they are available to make sure that no project would ever get to the point where it's stuck, it can't proceed because it can't find a way of delivering net gain. Anything that does get delivered off-site needs to go onto a new national biodiversity gain site register that started operating in the start of this year. And legally, a planning authority cannot approve a project as having met the net gain requirements where that project is looking to go off-site, unless that off-site land is on the National Net Gain Register. It's not possible for a planning authority to say you've met your gain requirements. So it is really important for any land that's going to be used for the purposes of helping developers provide net gain, ultimately get onto this register. It's a way to ensure that you or I can follow through, so we can track it through a planning application reference, for example, and see that if a development quite close to us is saying we've achieved our net gain, but we've done it off-site, well, we can go on and see, well, where have they done that? What are they doing? Who owns the lands, etc.? What management is being undertaken? So it's introducing a lot of transparency into the off-site system. It's open to anyone to potentially be an off-site provider. There are some eligibility criteria, but they're relatively limited. They're principally around have you got the right to or ownership of lands that allows you to commit to delivering and maintaining outcomes for 30 years, because legally you will have to manage these outcomes for 30 years. So that is the cost that you'll be essentially charging a developer to say how much it's going to be for you to deliver their gains for them. The other thing the register does is it also makes sure that we don't have a situation where landowners try and potentially game a system where they're looking to sell the same outcomes to multiple different developers as well. So it keeps people honest and provides transparency. And as I said, a project cannot commence, cannot satisfy its gain requirements unless any of the offsite land has got onto this register. And to do that, you ultimately need to have a legal agreement in place. So there needs to either be a Section 106 agreement, either a standalone agreement with the local planning authority that's not connected to a development, be party to a Section 106 that relates to the development, or through having a conservation covenant, which is another legal mechanism that came through from the Environment Act as well. So I talked about the importance of measurability and just for net gain, and this makes the metric really important because this is the mechanism for measuring. So what it does is it calculates the baseline value of the site before any development activity took place. So what was the baseline value? It calculates that in a currency called biodiversity units. And then you tell it essentially what habitat interventions you're proposing to make. So what new habitats are you creating, or what existing habitats are you improving? And it will then calculate whether that's likely to get you the minimum 10% gain or not. And you can also do this for offsite lands as well. And so it's using, as I said, habitats as a proxy measure for biodiversity. It's trying to stay simple in doing that because it recognizes this is something that lots of people are going to need to be able to use and operate. But the values for habitats within the metric are all kind of evidence-based as well. And the way it works, so if you're looking to do your baseline calculation, anything on the screen here in green is information you need to give it. So you tell it how big or long the particular habitat in question is. There's an assessment of the condition, typically undertaken by an ecologist of those habitats, and the strategic significance of that habitat. The metric itself will give values to how important the habitats are themselves. It breaks them down into distinctiveness bands. From at the very bottom, a score of 0 for concrete, so hard standing is also included in the metric, all the way up to a value of 8 for habitats that are really, really important. And then again, you tell it information about what you're proposing to do. So you put the same information again about the kind of types of habitats you're looking to propose. You also tell it where any offsite delivery is taking place. Is it on site or is it further afield? The metric will also then apply some kind of risk calculators to what you're telling it in terms of how difficult those habitats are to create and how long it's going to take to create them as well. And then it will give you a score, a biodiversity unit score. And it's designed to work for a whole range and variety of different types of projects. So I've just given you a kind of very basic introduction to it, but it's something that you can use for new towns and villages, really small scale urban interventions, big infrastructure projects. It includes developments around the coast, or the kind of intertidal habitats are included. And it's also a tool that landowners will be looking to use if they're looking to try and sell biodiversity units to developers who need to go off site. And again, that also includes people who are looking to rewild their lands as well. It can be used for them, and we'll hear more about that shortly. And it has a legal basis to it as well. So it is a statutory metric. So there's an act of parliament that underpins this metric, that contains the kind of values and the formula within the metric. The Act also says that in order to demonstrate you've used the statutory metric, you have to legally have used what it calls the metric package. And that's a calculation tool, which is an Excel-based tool, the guidance that comes with that, and the condition assessment methodology, which is what the ecologists will use to assess condition of habitats. So legally, you have to use those. You can't deviate from those. Natural England's also produced some kind of supplementary information and guidance in form of checklists, case studies, etc., to help people with the usage of the metric. So it's too early to say yet, because biodiversity net gain has only, in terms of mandatory requirements, only just started. So it's too early to be pointing to the kind of particular ecological outcomes it's been delivering. Most developments subject to it have only just started to get planning permission. But it's already led to quite dramatic changes and kind of beneficial outcomes. So firstly, it's led to a significant investment in private capital into nature as well. So we're aware of investment totaling at least £400 million that's gone forward into creating things like habitat banks, and other kind of beneficial tools for nature as well. So that's really welcome to see kind of new private sector investment going into nature. This also opens up a new income stream for landowners as well, be they farmers, managers of local authority parks or green space, and others as well. So it provides a way of getting developers basically to pay those landowners to improve the habitat management of their land. And in doing that, it also has the capacity to deliver a whole range of other kind of wider benefits as well. So at the start, I talked about the importance of habitats for nature, but also the wider benefits they can provide. So it also provides an opportunity to help with flood alleviation or urban cooling. So creating habitats, for example, higher up in a catchment can also help to reduce flood risk further down on that catchment. It's led to a real kind of plethora of kind of technology startups and interests. So, and that's from things such as the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to start looking at things around kind of habitat monitoring, all the way through to kind of particular tools for use by local governments or ecologists when they're actually kind of operating biodiversity net gain. And we're also seeing, as well as, so I mentioned that this is a global first, so we're the first country in the world that's tried to introduce this through legislation. A lot of other governments are now looking at this, but then the metric itself and versions of the metric are being used internationally now as well. So we're aware of its usage on every continent, bar Antarctica. It's been adapted clearly, but from in North America, in Saudi Arabia, in Nigeria, etc., people are starting to use the metric as well and seeing the value of it. It's also led to, and I think this is the really important bit, and to me, one of the really welcome aspects of biodiversity net gain, it's really changing the way that development thinks about nature. So in the past, you could kind of categorize or kind of characterize rather a lot of developments as having left nature as an afterthought. Typically, the scheme will be designed at the last minute. People think we need to make it green to get it through planning. It's handed to an ecologist. They've got little space to do anything with it, gets planning permission, quantity surveyor, then value engineers a lot of the nature back out, and no one thinks about the management and maintenance. And we're seeing a complete change now, particularly with some of the bigger developments, where nature's being considered much earlier on in the process. Site selection, outline design stage. People are looking to try and, whereas previously often sites were completely cleared of any kind of nature that was there, people are now recognizing that the more they can work with that nature, retain it and enhance it, the easier it's going to be for them to achieve net gain. And in doing that, it's then reinforcing the mitigation hierarchy as well. And it's fostering a much greater and more collaborative kind of endeavor between ecologists, landscape architects, civil engineers, working collaboratively rather than in silos to help co-create spaces that are good for nature and can deliver other benefits to the project. So it's generating that much more of a kind of team sport ethos. And people are now genuinely thinking about the fact that they need to manage and maintain this for 30 years. So bringing contractors in, talking to kind of management companies as well, getting them involved so that people, there's greater confidence that these schemes will go forward and be managed and maintained in a way that historically all too often wasn't the case. So just to wrap up, in terms of BNG, the earlier you can think about it, either as a development or a landowner, the better, and be thinking about the different ways that you might be able to contribute towards it. There is guidance. So Sharon talked about work that IEMA had done. There was some best practice work produced by Sirius, IEMA and IEMA a few years ago. That's still very relevant. There's also a British standard, BS 8683. It's a kind of design process standard, and there's now a kind of plethora of government guidance documents about biodiversity net gain. The more gains can be linked to local nature recovery strategies and local nature priorities, the better. So local nature recovery strategies are all being developed around England. And the way the metric works is it will incentivize you to deliver outcomes that link to those identified in the ONRS as well, where relevant. So the more you can kind of deliver against those, you'll get rewarded for doing those through biodiversity net gain. Familiarize yourself with the metric. There's lots of training now available on it from bodies like SCIEM or Field Studies Council or the Landscape Institute, and think about how, as a project, you're looking to try and deliver gains as well. Are you going to try and do it all on site? Are you going to go off site? If so, how and where? And be thinking about the long-term management and maintenance of the gains being delivered as well. And just finally, I think the slides will be made available, just some links to some further information about biodiversity net gain. But that's, you'll be pleased to hear, is it from me. So I shall stop sharing and hand back to Sharon.
Thank you, Nick. That was wonderful. Yeah, I mean, that was a really good overview, I think, of BNG, how it stands at the moment. And it is quite refreshing to see that there are benefits to be had from this process. Do you know what I mean? I think it's about where before adult corners could be cut or whatever, to get things through planning. It's really interesting now to know that people are taking this quite seriously. And, as you say, it's probably got a long way to go as well because it's only just quite new. So we've had a couple of questions, which I'll just ask on behalf of people, if that's okay. I mean, Julie asked if there was examples of permitted development because she has a housing development site near her where the woodland is being cut down because they're not ancient trees. They don't come under any tree preservation orders or anything like that. So because the land's owned privately, is that why they don't have to follow guidelines? Because private developers still have to do stuff?
They do. So that project, I mean, I don't know the details of it, but assuming it was assuming it only started this year, it would then be subject to biodiversity net gains. So if they're cutting down all the trees on site, they basically are starting to create quite a headache for themselves as well, because they're losing a lot of the kind of nature value that site had on it to begin with. So they will have to then look to try and kind of provide that either on site or off site somehow. So no, the fact that they're a private developer doesn't, no difference. There are, I mean, some projects though are permitted developments. So I know Northumbrian Water, for example, does quite a lot of typically quite small scale development activity, which often goes through as permitted development. So they don't need planning permission for it. But even they are saying that, as a company, they want to deliver that in a way that also achieves net gains. So there are schemes which are permitted, which although legally they don't have to do net gain, they're doing it anyway, which is really welcome, I think, and would encourage others to adopt the same kind of ethos and attitude. There's nothing about the metric that means that the fact that a scheme is permitted, it can't work, if that makes sense as well, so you can still use it.
Yeah, and I think it's going to basically instill a lot of best practice as well. And I think people will learn to share best practice, hopefully, as well with the schemes that they've done, and hopefully as that metric sort of use and the ability to do that builds up, I think it's all good, isn't it? It's all good for nature. I think
It
that's the
is.
most important thing.
And for me, one of the really exciting things about it was that in the past, unless there were protected species on a site, or unless the site had a kind of national or to some extent a local designation, everything else about nature was fair game. People didn't really consider it at all. Whereas now it's forcing people to essentially value everything that's on that site. They have to think about what are they going to do. So it very much is changing the way that development is having to kind of consider nature and demonstrate it can deliver positive things for nature.
Yeah. And then Michelle asked a question about are there plans for an on-site register published list to ensure that this is also transparent and maintained? I think that was probably, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So as I said, the offsite register currently only contains offsite information. It's certainly from a Natural England perspective, and I know for many others, we would really like to see on-site information included there. At the time, it was government argued that it would create an additional or an undue burden for planning authorities to put that information there. But having said that, the planning system itself is starting to go through a whole process of digitization, which should make that much easier to put that information there as well. So talking to government officials, they're very much of the view that they would like to get on site onto the register over, in the fullness of time. I think it's just a matter of when rather than if, hopefully.
Yeah. And are you still having the same problems that we used to have when we had community development with solar panels, for example? And it's about educating planning departments and educating the teams to be able to use the metrics and understand everything. Is that a big process of re-educating people as well to be able to do that
It
within
has
planning?
been. It is. So this is a really significant change in terms. I can't sort of emphasize that enough. And so we work very closely with an organisation called the Planning Advisory Service. So anyone from local government on the call who hasn't come across the Planning Advisory Service, I would encourage you to have a look at their website. They've got vast amounts of information now about biodiversity net gain. They run a lot of training sessions, both for officers and for members as well on BNG. And we've supported them a lot on that through things such as talking about the metric or management plans and just basically talking about the legislation. I mean, one of the challenges that particularly development managers in local governments face was, although the bill was passed in 2021 and the legislation didn't come into force until this year, a lot of the detail in terms of the secondary legislation wasn't known until the very last minute, so at the end of last year. So it didn't really give particularly development managers much chance to get familiarize themselves with the process. So I think the first 6 months has very much been a kind of learning curve for many people within planning, but also for some of the smaller developers as well, who a lot of the bigger developers have been doing versions of BNG for a while, but for SME builders, this is still quite new. So we're working with local government, working with the Landscape Institute, REBA for architects, obviously SAIM for ecologists, RTPI, et cetera, looking to try and help them upskill their members and other sectors that often hadn't really thought about nature particularly, but realizing, well, they have to go through planning and now they do need to think about nature as well. So making them aware of it too.
Yeah, and I think that's what Michelle was more or less saying on her questions is the backlog in the planning system. How will planning take on the additional workloads? Because obviously that will be adding to their. There's obviously examples that she's used as well there about how will the new register relate to councils, local councils, parish councils even, and all of those planning departments. I think we've kind of just more or less a little bit of covered that there with the extra pressure that's being put on local authorities.
Yeah, so government made additional monies available to local authorities to help them get ready for BNG. You know, you could always say that was not enough, but there was some money made available. I think it was around about £17 million, £18 million. And there are other opportunities for planning authorities to generate money out of BNG themselves as well. So one is through using their own land to, but a more kind of immediate and tangible opportunity is the use of pre-app advice services, for example. So we're encouraging people to engage with local government through pre-app advice to find out what locally people are looking to try and see provided. Obviously, local authorities can charge for that. Also, if they are looking to enable to set up Section 106 agreements with landowners, again, local government can charge for that. They can charge recoup the costs associated with monitoring those agreements over time as well. So there are ways as well that local government can kind of start to generate income and recoup costs through BNG. It's going to take a while for some of those to kick up. So there is a bit of a kind of invest to save type of case needed locally as well. And always, no one's ever going to say there shouldn't be more investment in local government. They should, and we all recognise that the kind of the parlous state of local government finances. But this is a new thing for them. But there are ways that they can begin to generate income out of it as well.
I think it's an evolving thing as well, isn't it? I think
Yeah,
BNG is obviously it's mandatory now. It's come in. I think everyone's finding their feet about what's going to happen, how things are going to work, and there'll never be one size fits all approach. I expect because the projects are all different. So,
yeah,
so I
and
think
parts.
that's good.
I was going to say part of the the idea behind having a kind of standardized metric, for example, and a standardized process is to try and streamline things. I mean, I think initially people are trying to get used to it and familiarize themselves with it, but in the past, kind of nature has got so contested through planning, but rightly or wrongly at times as well, where it being used as a kind of means of stopping development or kind of objecting, sometimes rightly, sometimes not. But also there was a power imbalance where all the power was with the developer. They had the money, they had the lawyers, and local government frankly didn't. Whereas now you've got, I think, more of a level playing field, and that everyone is using the same way of kind of valuing things. So it's not a case of my lawyers are more expensive than yours, so I can win an argument that this is much more valuable than is actually the case. So you've got much more a kind of objective way of assessing things, and a kind of hopefully a more kind of streamlined process as well of being able to get nature built into development and take some of the kind of friction out of that.
Yeah, yeah. And then Fiona's just asked, are there any funding pools available for small businesses or startups creating solutions to the rewilding process? And I mean, we might actually see some of this within Rachel's talk as well, I would imagine. So, but yeah, I mean, you're aware of anything that, is happening in the background, but without obviously going into Rachel's as well. We'll go into Rachel's talk about that.
So it's a good question. So I know there have been some funding rounds from government called, excuse me a sec, the sounds a bit like Smurf, NERF funding is called. So it's Natural Environment Investment Readiness Funds is to give it its full name. And I know some wildlife trusts and other bodies kind of bid in successfully for those as well. So I think the recent round is closed, but they're things to look out for. And beyond that, Rachel may have some other kind of thoughts. And that's the extent of my knowledge, I'm afraid, on that particular one. But happy to kind of talk to colleagues as well and come back to see if there's other funding opportunities.
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
think what
don't
we
have
do
much
is,
to add. Sorry, Sharon.
yeah, sorry, Rachel, yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry. I was just going to say I don't have much to add to that. I think NERF would be a good one if they do another funding round. I think the latest one they were kind of focusing on larger landowners. But yeah, there's always kind of little pots that come up as well. I don't know if Sarah from Rewilding Britain has any ideas there either.
Yeah, Sarah's just had to pop off to another meeting, but I was just going to
Ah,
interject for her really because one of the
mhm.
things to bear in mind is that there are an awful lot of funds happening now that we either have access through the Elms funds or anything spin-off funding as well. So we will be probably looking at that through the network as well. I know Sarah has some information on the Rewilding Britain network as well. So anyone who's on the call who needs more information on that, please do get in touch with us and we'll channel that information out to people because we'll be able to put stuff on the network, but then find some information as well. And
The
we're
only
just
thing
looking at,
the only
sorry.
quick thing I would just say on funding as well is just one thing to watch out for, is that if you're looking to try and generate biodiversity units to sell to developers, it needs to be what you're creating needs to be over and above something that's already been paid for by someone else. So think of, if you're looking to funding, no issue at all. If it's around doing kind of preparatory works in terms of surveys, etc., no issue when it comes to access or fencing or signage. It's just, if it's actually paying for habitat works, then in order to be able to sell biodiversity units, you'd have to be able to say what I'm doing is more than what I'm already being paid to do in terms of an
So like a
ecological
specific
outcome.
habitat bank, really. You
Yeah,
create almost a space that, which is what a lot of people are starting to do now, isn't it? I mean, creating specific areas where they can allocate purely for BNG work, which is something we're going to cover as well in the next sessions. Everybody that's on this call today, there will be another session called BNG in Action, where we'll be featuring work that is being done by, for example, local wildlife trusts around creating areas specifically for BNG. I'm just conscious of the time now, so apologies if we haven't asked everybody's questions, but if there's time at the end, we'll come back to them if that's okay. So so let's go on to Rachel. Rachel, and thank you very much, Nick, as well. That was really, really good, really enlightening. And if you're around at the end of the session as well, we'll might have some more questions for you. Yeah, thank you. So Rachel, hi. We just welcome your presentation as well. And Rachel's from Nattergal, and you can tell everybody about what you do, because instead of me doing that.
Great. Can you see my screen? Can you just see the presentation?
We can indeed. Yeah, we can.
Fabulous. Brilliant. Yeah, so as Sharon said, I'm Rachel and I'm the landscape ecologist at Nattergal. And what we are a nature restoration company. I joined earlier this year, so I think I've been here around 6 months now. But before that, I worked as an ecological consultant, and that was mainly large infrastructure projects, so things like road, rail. And for the last few years, my work there was very much kind of focused on BNG. So that was aiding developers in preparing for mandatory BNG, helping them design BNG on site into their developments. Some of our clients did have their own internal BNG targets prior to it being mandatory, so it was really great to support them with that. And I'll definitely reiterate Nick's point that I did see, BNG really bring this change from nature as an afterthought in development to nature really having a place around the table and being considered from the very start of development, so site selection, kind of initial design stage, which was great. I think it's been a really positive thing. So I'm now working at Nattergal, so approaching things differently. So now as an off-site BNG provider, and that's with a focus on restoring nature through the restoration of natural processes. We weren't set up to be a BNG unit provider, but they are a byproduct of what we do, and we do see it as being a really one of the best sources of potential funding for us at this stage. So as Nick mentioned before, while developers should be aiming to deliver net gain on their development site, so on-site BNG, sometimes that's just not possible, and sometimes it doesn't deliver the best outcome for biodiversity. And in that case, developers can look off-site, and this might involve biodiversity units from companies such as Nattergal. So now that Nick has given a bit of an overview of BNG, what I'll be doing is talking about how Nattergal are delivering off-site BNG through natural process-led nature restoration. So how it's working in practice really, and hopefully also demonstrating some of the key concepts that Nick covered. So I'll introduce Nattergal in a bit more detail. I'll talk through the aims and the principles of the company. I'll talk a bit about why we think what we're doing is so important and how BNG fits into that. And I'll cover our approach to nature restoration and BNG and the progress we've made so far. So we were co-founded by Charlie Burrell of the Knepp Estate with the aim of delivering nature recovery at scale to provide vital benefits for society and sustainable financial returns. So what we want is to become a world-leading nature restoration company. And I appreciate that a nature restoration company is a relatively new concept. So the sort of work we do is typically work that's more associated with nature conservation charities. But globally, there is a massive nature restoration financing gap. So it's around $700 billion a year. And private finance is going to be really vital in closing that. So with Charlie Burrell as a co-founder, we are very much inspired and influenced by the Knepp estate. I know many of you have a keen interest in rewilding, so you probably know a lot about Knepp already. You might have read Isabella Tree's book, you might have watched the recent film that came out, and you might have even visited. But in summary, within 15, 20 years, Knepp transformed from a low-yielding arable and dairy farm to one of the most well-known sites for nature in the UK. So the bird species like turtle dove, cuckoos, nightingales, which have thrived despite undergoing massive declines in other parts of the country. The soils are starting to recover, so soil organic carbon, microbial biomass in the soils has doubled, fungal biomarkers have tripled, and the site now has the highest population of purple emperor and brown hair streak butterflies in the UK, and that's just to name a few of their achievements. It's a really exciting project and something we use certainly as an inspiration for what we're doing at Nattergal. So these are our values, our operating principles and core beliefs as a company. So for us, nature comes first. We do prioritise nature in all our actions and decisions. We also believe collaboration multiplies impact. So we know that by sharing our learnings, seeking local knowledge and collaborating with others, we can find more effective solutions and move faster in what we're doing. And I think a great example of this is our expert days. So when we buy a site, one of the first things we do is we invite a group of local experts, so local naturalists, landowners, representatives of wildlife trusts, universities, councils, all sorts of people, to show them around the site and basically ask what they would do with it. So get some ideas on what they think we could do to maximise benefits for nature and also create a site that works for both biodiversity and people. And that also fits in well with our final value, which is act local. So tackling the twin biodiversity and climate crises starts with local actions, and we know we'll only succeed in what we're doing if we can bring local communities along with us. And then we have our operating principles. So our approach is to restore degraded ecosystems. So the land we purchase or manage is of limited ecological value at baseline, with the potential for uplift and enhancement. Because of this, the land tends to have poor ecological functionality, so it often requires initial interventions to kind of kickstart these dynamic natural processes. So we might look at things like wildflower seeding to introduce missing grassland species. We might dig ponds. We might look at river restoration if we've got watercourses running through the site. And then ultimately, we're also always looking at the introduction of free roaming herbivores. We also look to support local communities by providing access to nature. And we do all this under a biodiversity-led financial model. So for us, a dynamic functioning ecosystem is always a priority, and the income streams that result from our work are essentially a byproduct of this. So why now? The reason that companies like ours are starting to pop up is because finally society seems to be grasping the enormity and these impacts of the global decline in biodiversity, including its links to climate change, which I think is really important. We also now have companies recognising their dependencies on nature. So many of their activities rely on functioning ecosystems, and that's finally being recognised. And we now also have legally binding targets globally as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that includes the 30 by 30, so the protection of 30% of global land and seas for nature by 2030. And because of all this, we have these market-based instruments that are kickstarting private sector investment into nature conservation. So that's things like carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and BNG. So currently mandatory BNG does only apply in England, but I believe Scotland and Wales are looking at similar initiatives. And I just think it's so important that we make BNG work here. So the UK is one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world. I know that Nick covered that and kind of shared a few of these similar statistics, and you've probably all heard it before. But just to reiterate, yeah, one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world. Since the 1970s, we've lost, I think, at least half of our biodiversity. We've lost 90% of UK wetland habitats over the last 100 years. And as I'm sure everyone knows, very few of the rivers in England have good ecological status. They are in a very dire strait, and these problems need addressing ASAP. Obviously, again, you all know the degradation of nature has massive implications for us. So for our water and soil quality, water provisioning, food security, just to name a few. And BNG is one of the legal mechanisms that has been brought in to help address these issues in England. Ah, yes, I forgot it did that. So this is just a picture of a field in Knepp, actually. So I imagine the first photo was taken around 15, 20 years ago. And then you can see it's taken from the same viewpoint. This is the kind of, nature uplift that's happened over that time. You've gone from an arable field to a nice kind of scrubby grassland mosaic. So I'm just going to run through how we approach our sites. So our overall approach is kind of BNG. To BNG is nature first and units second. So we're very much driven by what we think is best for biodiversity, and then we see BNG units as essentially a byproduct of this. So the way we approach our sites is at first we like to do a really thorough kind of baseline, gather loads of baseline data, learn what we can about the site. For BNG purposes, this will be a UK HAB survey and a habitat condition assessment, which is published with the statutory biodiversity metric. So we can then complete the metric and determine our baseline biodiversity units. But we do also baseline key species groups, so birds, bats, invertebrates, soil fauna. And we use multiple kind of methodologies to do this. We also look at baseline carbon. We really get to know our hydrology, kind of topography, and of course we learn from the local community as well. What we then do is we plan based on what we think is best for nature and what we think is the best way to deliver that, using our learnings from all our baseline surveys and from local communities. And only then will we calculate the associated BNG unit uplift using the metric calculator. So what we want is we want to use the metric in a way that works for nature. We don't want to kind of blindly follow the numbers and let the numbers influence what we do on site too much. Finally, we will then, hopefully, the plan is deliver nature recovery through the restoration of natural processes and sell those associated ecosystem services, whether it be BNG units or things like carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and nutrient credits. So far, we have 3 sites that we own and manage, and we hope that BNG will be one of the core sort of initial funding streams for nature restoration on these sites. They are all fairly large in size. We do know that if we want to really reinstate natural processes, the bigger, the better. So we do try and target sites that are over 200 hectares where we can. So first we have Boothby Wildland. That was our first site. I believe that was purchased around 3 years ago. And it's our largest site as well at 600 hectares in size. So that's grade 3 arable land that we are now gradually retreating from arable production. And what we're looking at here is selling ecosystem services. So that will include biodiversity units, and we're also looking at carbon and potentially natural flood management there as well. We then have High Fen Wildland in Norfolk. So that's our second site, and it's around 300 hectares in size. So that's ex-arable on lowland peat. And here likely funding streams include BNG and peatland carbon, but we're also exploring water-related ecosystem services here as well. And then we've got our newest site. So this is Harold's Park Wildland in Essex. And we haven't officially publicised that we've taken this site on yet, but I imagine that'll be done in the next few weeks. And what that is 206 hectares of arable land and modified grassland that was used as pony paddocks until a year or so ago. And for this site, we think most of it will likely go into BNG, but we're also exploring other natural capital markets there as well. And I'm going to go into the first 2 sites in a little more detail in a sec. But I just thought now would be a good time to touch on the spatial risk multiplier. So what this map shows essentially is the local planning authority, so LPA areas, and the national character areas, so NCA areas, that our sites sit within in blue, and then the neighbouring LPA and NCA areas in yellow. And you can see that covers quite a large proportion of Eastern England. And this essentially illustrates how the spatial risk multiplier would be applied in the metric. So the spatial risk multiplier applies to off-site interventions only, and essentially penalises proposals where off-site habitat is located at a distance from the development site. So if you were purchasing off-site units from an off-site provider, you would generally be wanting to look at projects within the same LPA and NCA as your development, if possible, if there are off-site units available in that area. And then if not, looking at the neighbouring LPA and NCA. So there's some really great guidance in the statutory metric user guide on this. I think it probably explains it a lot better than I have, but definitely worthwhile having a look if you are a developer and you are looking at purchasing off-site units at some point. So now just going to delve into two of our sites in just a little more detail. So this one here is Boothby Wildland, so our site in Lincolnshire, our 600 hectare site. And this here is what it looked like a few years ago at baseline. So you can see it was very much dominated by arable land, which in the metric would represent a low BNG baseline. So it'd be worth a low number of BNG units. So based on our approach, my colleagues sat back and thought, what's best for nature at this site? And decided here that natural process-led rewilding with some specific ecological kickstarters would really get things going and would be the best thing to do. So these kickstarters included things like digging ponds, so a number of ponds have been dug there now, and more to come, spreading wildflower seeds, spreading green hay. And we also have river restoration planned on the West Glen that runs pretty much kind of through the centre of that western block. And an enclosed beaver release is also planned there, which is quite exciting. And then in the next few years, we'll also be looking at introducing large free-roaming herbivores, so things like potentially longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies. Very much learning from NEP here. I think the site will end up looking fairly similar in terms of it becoming a kind of mosaic of grassland, scrub and young woodland. So that's kind of a vision that a company called Dig & Co produced for us, showing what we would like the site to ultimately look like. And if you see the three areas highlighted in green, so those outlying areas, that's where we have our first lot of BNG units, and they are going to be woodland, lowland meadow, the neutral grassland and ponds. And what we decided was, due to their location, it would be best to have these as more traditionally managed rather than process-led. So these areas are essentially cut off from the main blocks of the site by roads, so access to free roaming herbivores just wouldn't be possible there. And they are quite small when considered alone, so it'd be harder to kind of rewild them, essentially. So that's our kind of first tranche of BNG units that will go under more traditional management. And it's worth noting that here and on all of our sites, when it comes to BNG, we are being relatively precautionary. So we are aiming for lower condition scores and largely, kind of, for want of a better word, unambitious habitats. So most of the habitats will end up being habitats of medium distinctiveness, and particularly in that kind of core main rewilding block, and likely moderate condition as well. So this is our second site. This is High Fen in Norfolk. It was ex-arable, but it's actually been under conservation grazing, I believe, for a number of years now. It's been under grass. I think it was very hard to farm. So again, we've looked here at what would be best for nature, and it was decided that what really needed to be focused on was the hydrology of the site. So it's a really nice kind of watery paradise, just full of winter and birds during the winter months, and part of the autumn. But then come summer, it just almost completely dries out. Not so much this year, because we have had some of the highest kind of rains on record. But most years it's just almost completely dry. We have peat here, so that dries out and is degrading. So what we're hoping to do is re-wet this site and hopefully both boost biodiversity and restore the peat at the same time. And interestingly to me as an ecologist, the underlying primary UK habitat on this site is modified grassland, so it's a low distinctiveness habitat. But it's actually considered most of the site to be floodplain grazing marsh. So it actually ends up being a high distinctiveness habitat in the metric. It is in poor condition though. So what we have is an opportunity to enhance that condition by lifting the water table. And again, we are being precautionary with our targets here, which I think is quite important when you've got kind of a process-led rewilding site. And I forgot that, yeah, again, we've got one of those visions for high fen too. You can see our vision is that it becomes a lot wetter, but we also have these areas of kind of higher ground where we are going to be looking at creating other habitats, so scrub, potentially some neutral grasslands and calcareous grasslands as well. So I think to sum up the key BNG challenges for us, I don't know if Nick's here still, but Nick can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the statutory biodiversity metric was designed with large-scale process-led rewilding in mind, which is fine. Its main purpose is on-site BNG on development site, and I think it works really well for that. But that does mean it requires a bit of thought for us when we're using it for kind of essentially what are rewilding projects, where obviously the end destination isn't as clear-cut as it is for more managed habitats. What National England have done, they've published a really useful rewilding and BNG case study. That's available. I think if you look for the additional kind of BNG material, just type that into Google, that should come up. And that gives an indication of how they anticipate BNG being applied in a lowland agricultural landscape, which is really useful for us, and I know for a number of projects too. What it does is it advises on how to predict future habitat types. So it kind of makes clear that things like baseline habitats, neighbouring habitats, geology, topography, hydrology can all help to determine the habitats that will likely form. And it does also note that in these situations, it is always best to be precautionary and realistic with your predicted habitat types. We also need to think about how we reflect mosaics of habitat in the metric. So for us, we don't always know exactly what habitat will spring up where, but we can anticipate where we're likely to get mosaics of habitat. So mosaics of scrub and grassland, like we have at NEP, for example. So although we won't know exactly which square metre will be scrub and which will be grassland, we can instead look at predicting the likely proportions that might form and then use that to inform what we then input into the metric. And I think something that's been a challenge for many off-site BNG providers or would-be providers has been getting legal agreements in place. So that's definitely something that we've needed to tackle. So these are essentially the legal obligations to enhance and maintain the habitats for a minimum 30-year period, which you do need to register your off-site units. So for us, we've been working on both Section 106 agreements with LPAs for some of our sites and then conservation covenants with responsible bodies for others. But the process has been a lot slower than we'd initially anticipated it would be. And I think a lot of people are finding that. And then finally, I think one of the key challenges is also how to avoid unit farming. So that's kind of a term I would use for the practice of perhaps being too led by the metric numbers and not necessarily doing the best thing for nature on a particular site. So instead doing whatever you can to maximise the unit output on site as much as possible. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a challenge to not be too driven by those numbers. I think it is very important sometimes to just step away from the metric when you're going to decide or coming up with a plan on how to approach nature restoration on your site and then go to the metric second. I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Am I still sharing my screen?
Yeah, I can stop you sharing if you like. There you go.
Thank you.
There you go. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. One question I have, Rachel, for you is with Nattergal's service, I suppose, service provision, I can see that you've got the three big sites now. You've got the Lincolnshire, the
Yeah.
Norfolk, and the Essex site. is there going to be an opportunity to buy, land elsewhere? Have you got a remit for a region, for example, or can you work out of region? Can you come up as far as the northeast, for example? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Is there anything
yeah.
land based anywhere really? Is it that kind of
Yeah,
approach?
absolutely. I think we're just constrained. We're quite particular on the sites that we need. We need kind of a low baseline in terms of ecology, but we don't want it to be really productive farmland because we don't want to take that out of production. And also the size as well can be quite a constraint because if we want to, yeah, get kind of natural processes going, we need kind of these big blocks of habitat that aren't, even if it's a big farm, sometimes it can often be broken up by roads. So size is another factor as well. But yeah, absolutely, we're definitely looking. I'm very keen for more sites in the northwest. I don't think we've got any. Yeah, we've not got many, certainly near me,
Yeah,
kind of
well,
big,
we've got, I
exciting
mean, I was
rewilding
thinking,
projects.
I was just thinking northwest, northeast, all of these areas that
Yeah.
might need that little bit of help, I suppose, because I think
Mhm.
the two things that stand out to me are investment opportunities,
Mhm.
and money. Obviously, if people don't have money to kickstart that project, but they might need the help of an organization that does, then there's that opportunity. But then
Yeah,
there's also
definitely.
the expertise and the experience. I mean, you can't get any more experience than that, than NEP really. It's a
Yeah.
case study that's worked. I mean, it's a case study that's been going a long time and it's a working case study. I think that's
Mhm.
really good to sort of a lot of people have benefited from the expertise and the experience and the knowledge that's come out of NEP as well, which is really important. So I think from my perspective, people who are on the call today, look into things like Nattergal and obviously other service providers and also our local wildlife trust, which the next event that we run will be two major wildlife trusts in our region talking about how they are adapting BNG and getting that to work for projects. I think it's brilliant. I think it's really good that the work that you're doing, and it's very encouraging to see that there are, landscapes that can be
Mhm.
worked on and that can fit the metrics as well, which, obviously, I know Nick would agree that the metrics were a bit of a challenge originally, weren't they, to try and get them to recognise scrub, for example. Do you know what I mean? It's the value of scrub is really important, but how did we measure that? And I think that was really encouraging to see there's a way that you can do that now.
Agree. And Rachel made a really important point as well, which she said a few times about the need to be precautionary. And I absolutely endorse that. But actually, financially, that also makes a lot of sense as well, because what that means is that, particularly, say, for example, in the rewilding context, that if you know or you're fairly confident that you'll hit your precautionary estimate without too much difficulty. But in all likelihood, that habitat is going to continue to evolve and improve over time. What that then opens up is the possibility of then entering subsequent BNG agreements and selling that continual uplift. So there's a question in the chat about, well, what after 30 years? So if you're managing woodlands or if you've got habitats that, or a site that you think actually the ecology will keep improving, then don't overclaim. A really bad way of using the metric would be to say if you had an arable site and you said, my long-term ambition is to become kind of woodland parkland type of habitat, you actually biodiversity unit value of going from arable to that is really low because the metric says, well, that's really difficult to do and it's likely not to not work. And so you won't get many units if you tell it that. But if you then break that down, which is what the guidance note on rewilding that Rachel alluded to says, and just break it into chunks of time and saying, well, a process of natural progression is likely to lead to these types of habitats evolving over a period. Then you've then got kind of potentially multiple opportunities to sell over a much longer time period potentially as well. So rather than this being 30 years worth of funding, you can potentially extend that out quite a bit. And you don't even need to have got to the 30-year point if the habitat has reached the condition you said you're going to achieve, within year 10, for example. You can then sell again at that point if you're confident that actually you can continue to improve. So you can use it on that kind of staggered basis as well.
Yeah, and I mean that brings me to a couple of questions actually. One from Paul and the other one is this kind of linked really, from Michelle, I think it is. Yeah, there's two. One is about the long-term 30-year target, obviously, is in an uncertain world, obviously we're in a climate and a biodiversity emergency, how can we guarantee that BNG for that 30-year period? And if there a stipulation, you probably already covered it, is there a stipulation that that land cannot be developed, obviously, because it can't be retracted and then built on? You know what I mean? Is that's kind of, and then there was the abuse of that land as well. You know, is there a way that it's being monitored to make sure we don't greenwash, to want of a
Yeah.
word, or BNG wash?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's two kind of questions there that people have asked the question about.
Yeah. Nick, were you going to go, or I'm happy to kind of.
You go and I'll chip in
Yeah,
after you, potentially.
yeah. So all our land and all off-site kind of BNG providers' land will be secured by legal agreements for 30 years. So that'll either be Section 106 or a conservation covenant with a responsible body. So that means the land will be secured for BNG over that time. We will, and other off-site providers will have to come up with a monitoring plan. So we will need to be monitoring our land to make sure we're kind of hitting those BNG targets. But then also the responsible body who we have the conservation covenant with, or the LPA, will also be monitoring us and kind of making sure we are kind of following the habitat management and monitoring that we have said we will put in place. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Nick.
Yeah, and Rachel, you also made the point as well about it can take a while to negotiate and get legal agreements set up, and they're really important documents, these as well. One thing that's just been released, I can't remember if it's the beginning of this week or end of last week. There are now some template Section 106 agreements that have been developed jointly by the Planning Advisory Service with Denton's, the legal firm. So they're worth looking at as well, because they may help to kind of essentially fast track some of those legal agreements. But pay attention to the clauses when you're entering in, when you're negotiating an agreement, because if they're sensibly written, then they should be doing two things. They should recognize the fact that, as the person said, 30 years is a long time. Things can change in that period of time. So you would expect people to be using adaptive management techniques potentially to respond to changes. Climate may have an impact on what you're delivering. So if you think that what you're proposing is potentially likely to be particularly susceptible to climate change, make sure the agreement is written in a way that it hasn't kind of locked you in so rigidly to something that from the outset you were not that confident in. So there's scope to be more flexible. A good agreement would also recognize the fact that there are things which often get described as acts of God scenarios, which it would be really unfair to take action against a landowner if this happened, it meant they couldn't deliver. So, for example, my land is now part of the sea, next door caught fire, and everything's burnt down. So you shouldn't be penalised by that. But ultimately, these are legal contracts, and it means that ultimately you've entered into something that potentially you could be taken to court over if you've made absolutely no attempt to deliver on this. That shouldn't happen because, as Rachel said, there are ongoing monitoring and reporting requirements built into BNG. So there should be plenty of opportunity for you and the body you're accountable to say things have gone awry, what we're doing about it, and to come up with a kind of a plan. But ultimately, if you don't do anything, you are at risk of ending up in court as a consequence of this. And Sharon, on your point about this land just being developed, the fact that someone is set up as an offsite provider doesn't mean that land has been sterilised in a sense. So it doesn't make development on that land impossible. But what it does mean is that if that landowner decided that actually, do you know what, I'm going to sell up to Tesco's rather than, well, A, they're in breach of contract for the BNG outcomes, so they've got a legal consequence of that. And then B, assuming it was Tesco's then have a baseline that, irrespective of what the actual site looks like, is what the landowner had agreed to deliver. So again, it makes it much more difficult for them to meet their own net gain requirements because they're having to they've got a much higher baseline as a result of it as well. So it doesn't prevent you, but strong advice would be don't go down that route.
Yeah, and I think another there's a couple of questions as well as I'm looking at as well, which are about succession models into rewilding intervention. So ongoing succession and sustainability, I would imagine. a post 30-year situation as well. So obviously that could be, we get to 30 years, we're done. What happens after that? So there's a couple of sort of succession model question from Paul, and then it's a question from Eve to say, how do you plan to fund the ongoing management post 30 years and BNG carbon credit funding? So is there a succession plan that is put in place for that particular site as well?
Yeah, so for our sites, we're actually hoping to kind of go beyond 30 years and manage them and use them for nature in perpetuity. So we will be exploring potentially legal agreements that go beyond those 30 years. I think Nick made a great point about kind of staggering the BNG. So yeah, be precautionary to start with. Look at your kind of medium distinctiveness habitats, so a nice kind of scrub grass and mosaic, and then habitats that take quite a bit longer to develop. So things like wood pasture or lowland mixed deciduous woodland. You could then potentially look at remodeling in the future, and looking and seeing if you could hit those higher kind of yielding habitats and then sell those additional units there. But in the long term, we are also looking at kind of funding through ecotourism, kind of sale of wild meats, things like that. So that kind of NEP model, I know that that's kind of one of the ways that NEP is currently funding that project. So there are things we're looking at as well. It's not just going to be purely based on natural capital markets, is the idea in the long term.
Yeah.
And
Anything
again,
to
I
add to
think
that, Nick?
I was just going to say again, I think that's a really good point as well about diversifying. Kind of, I think it's good advice for any business as well. Don't become totally dependent on one potential source, because B&G is a market, and the fact that you've created a habitat doesn't necessarily mean anyone's going to buy it either. So always be thinking about, it's there, it potentially is available, it could be a really helpful source of income, but also explore other avenues as well.
Yeah, and I think that probably getting on to sort of some of the last questions as well. There was a question from Nigel, obviously, about involving the local public in certain sites
Mm.
and the balance between community engagement and community involvement, and then leaving the land to do what it needs to do. So has that been pretty much of a challenge in projects that you've worked with, Rachel, in keeping people off the land, but then getting people on the land and getting the balance right? Is that
Yeah,
something you've had
we're
to?
really keen on getting the balance right. And obviously, we see the importance of connecting people with nature. We think that disconnection is a massive issue. And we're hoping on some of those sites we can kind of help solve that in the local community. So I would say Boothby would be the best case study for that. So that's the site we've had the longest. And so it's located in Lincolnshire, and there are a few small communities kind of located at kind of either end of the site. So what we're doing there is we're doing weekly volunteer parties. We do monthly free walks for local people, so we can take them around the site, explain what we're doing. Recently, we had a nature day at a weekend, and I think we had over 100 people in the end kind of attended that. So that was lots of local families, but people from outside the wider area. So we're doing moth trapping, I think a dawn chorus walk, butterfly walks, that sort of thing. So it's something we're very keen on. But at the same time, we do want to make sure that kind of the level of access is appropriate, and it's not kind of reducing the value of our sites for nature. So that's definitely something we are thinking about. So for the new site, we have quite a few public footpaths. So I'm trying to work out where we can place ponds so that we don't have issues with kind of dogs potentially accessing those, and the issues that can come with that. So it's definitely a balancing act, but it's something we are I think, as a company, very on top of. And one of our values is that kind of connection between nature and people.
Yeah, have you had that, Nick, with any of the work that you've been doing? Have you had sort of like that balance between community engagement as a challenge?
Yeah, and I mean, there's stuff that can happen off-site, as Rachel said, but on-site in particular, in terms of obviously, typically you'll be looking to create habitats either where people are living or going to be living or where they're working, and it does present real opportunities then. So there's scope for looking to include people and communities in the ongoing kind of management potential of those sites. I think good practice is the more people can also be engaged with the design of things as well, so have a sense of ownership. I mean, I think one thing always to bear in mind is that it's very easy to sort of forget that not everyone likes nature either. And so thinking about, or people don't necessarily like nature, but they don't like it when it looks messy. And often doing things that are more nature friendly do look slightly less neat and tidy. And so simple things like just having signage or things that explain why an area looks like it does. It's not been forgotten or abandoned. And think that, people get concerned if they think the site's just been neglected, and it's not. It's like that deliberately. But also, and this is where particularly landscape architects, I think, can come to the fore, thinking about design as well, so that there's bits that do look possibly slightly more aesthetically pleasing, which are along pathways or on sight lines, but there's other areas which, there's much greater flexibility to kind of let go, if you like. And sometimes people can try and be helpful, but do something that's actually not helpful. So an area that's been left along, the grass has been left uncut. Local resident thinks, oh, forgotten to mow it, I'll go and mow it for them. And well, it was left uncut for a reason. So things like that, just to, I think, there are huge benefits to come from working with people and engaging them, but it's important they understand and that you're communicating with them while you're doing particular things as well, because sometimes people can be well intentioned but still do the wrong thing, if that makes sense.
I agree, and I think that's a really important part of any BNG project as well, is going to be communication and education, is making sure people realise why it needs to be a certain way, and that's going to really help the balance between having the public access to site and not. So I think Alice mentioned it in her response as well about creating disturbance where it doesn't need to be. So I think there's a lot to consider, isn't there, really, as we wrap up this event, really. Thanks to everybody who's put the questions in. Apologies if we've missed anybody, but I think we've gone through everything that we needed to know. I've certainly got a lot of information from both of your talks. Thank you very much. It's become clearer now. I'm no longer mystified, or I can, I'm mystified, but not. I can demystify. So I think it's there's a lot to consider. So I think there was one more question as well, from a quick question about, BNG. Might it inhibit affordable housing due to the development nature of it? It's along there, but obviously it's basically, is the unit price will be reduced? Could this type of housing be dropped by the developers because it's too problematic? Might that be an issue with BNG? Are developers, I mean, they've got to do it anyway, though, haven't they now? So they don't have a choice. So is it going to be an issue where they just don't build there?
Yeah. So this often comes up as a concern, and I understand why. A lot of work was done by government looking into the impacts of BNG on viability of schemes, and they were satisfied that it wasn't going to impact viability. And as you said, legally, BNG, you have to, if you're subject to, you have to do it. And obviously there's other, there can be other planning requirements that you need to deliver as well. And one thing for local governments to be aware of, the law allows for local authorities to ask for more than 10%, and some are doing so. But whereas 10% can't be challenged on viability grounds, anything over it can. So if you're a local authority, make sure you've got, A, you've articulated what your policy is, and B, confident you can defend it if taken to appeal. I think the more we can get a market going as well. So it's great to hear, Nattergal's kind of plans to kind of bring units forward for the market. The more we've got local providers, then some of the prices should also, it's a market, so they will start to come down as well. But again, going back to what I said at the start, thinking about BNG from the very beginning, so that you're designing your development in the first place to essentially reduce what you're going to need to do as a gain at the outcome of it, is good practice, and that will also help to kind of assuage concerns around affordability, I think.
excellent answer. Thank you very much. Yeah, so on that note, we are 1 minute away from finishing the event. Can I just say thank you to our speakers, Rachel and Nick? It's been a pleasure. It's been brilliant. We've really enjoyed it. If we can keep in touch, there might be another opportunity to input into the next event, or certainly the 1 year on event, I suppose. We can see where we are 1 year down the line. Rachel, I expect you to have loads more projects by then as well. So even some in
I
the
hope so,
Nordics, you never
yeah.
know. You never know. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you everyone for attending. Please do keep an eye out for the next event coming up, which will be Biodiversity in Action. We'll publicise that on all of our social media channels. And thank you to the speakers today as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nick
Pleasure.
and Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Bye.
Thanks for organising. Bye.